All right, welcome back to another and our final webinar in the series for Religion to Reality, and happy Feast of the Immaculate Conception. We're glad to be with you, and we really appreciate you taking the time out of your day to be here with us. Our goal today in this webinar, as it has been throughout this series, is to inspire and inform you so that you might connect with those you serve and others who serve in ministry. We hope that you come away today with some key insights that allow you to improve the effectiveness of your ministry by relying on the data rather than hunches. In particular, we're hoping to support you in building your ministry and helping those you serve lead an integrated life by decompartmentalizing their spiritual journey. In fact, that's why we call this Religion to Reality. Through all of the webinars in this series, we're going to be interactively discussing what it means to live an integrated life, where we're not just obligated to go to church on Sundays, but we actually live our faith in each part of our life, internally and externally. This is what transforms religion from a responsibility or a social club into reality, every part of our lives. And we'll get more into that. In the meantime, I'd like you to all answer a few very easy questions. These are demographics questions, since that's what we're going to be talking about today, that we asked in the original discipleship survey that we're going to be kind of exploring. So it'll allow us to compare this group with that study. So remember, these questions are anonymous. Nick, would you please throw the first question up on the screen for everyone to answer? Simple question. How old are you? Just let us know your age. Again, you don't need to lie. this is anonymous. No one's going to know. It's just a helpful gauge for us to see who's listening today. And hopefully that didn't take very long. So let's go ahead and throw the second poll up there as well, asking about your gender. Are you male or female? Go ahead and put that one up there. Thank you. Okay, I expect that to take no time at all. So we're going to just move right along into our prayer. So Father John, would you please lead us in prayer from St. Francis de Sales?
Sure. So we pray in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Do not look forward in fear to the changes and chances of this life. Rather, look to them with full confidence that as they arise, God to whom you belong will, in his love, enable you to profit by them. He has guided you thus far in life, and he will lead you safely through all trials. When you cannot stand it, God will carry you in his arms. Do not fear what may happen tomorrow. The same everlasting Father who cares for you today will take care of you then and every day. He will either shield you from suffering or he will give you unfailing strength to bear it. Be at peace then, and put aside all anxious thoughts and imaginations. We ask this all through Christ our Lord. Amen. And we ask the Blessed Mother's intercession today on her feast. Amen.
Amen.
Father, Son, Holy Spirit. Amen.
Thank you very much. All right. So, as you know, you're here to hear about generational differences in discipleship, which we're calling Same Goal, Different Roads. During this webinar, the chat is disabled, but you can ask questions at any time using the Q&A button in the Zoom interface. And if you ask questions, we generally hold them till the end, but if it seems really pertinent to the conversation in the moment, I may stop and answer. So feel free to ask them at any time. The webinar is being recorded. You'll be able to access it in a few days as soon as it's posted. And we also make the slide deck available. The slides we're going to go through today represent only maybe 2/3 of the slides in the deck, because there's a huge appendix of stuff that we're not going to be able to get to today. So I definitely encourage you to go back and download it once it's available to see all of the data that we're releasing about generational differences. Today, I'll introduce you to our speakers. We'll talk about the findings. We'll do the we'll have a discussion after that. Then we'll go into Q&A. And then, and like I said, there's an appendix that we will not talk about on this during the webinar. So without further ado, let's talk about our speakers. Rosie Chinea Shawver is a native of Southern California and the executive director of the Catholic Campus Ministry Association. She has worked as the director of campus ministry at the USC Caruso Catholic Center in Los Angeles and the University of New Mexico. Prior to this role, she was the executive director of the Catholic Association for Latino Leadership. She also has experience in working on the border in El Paso and at Catholic Charities in the Archdiocese of Santa Fe. Rosie has her BA in psychology and a minor in healthcare and social issues from UC San Diego and a master's in divinity from the Jesuit School of Theology in Berkeley. She has one daughter, Sophia Rose, who is 13 years old, and a wonderful husband, Mike, who is a theology teacher and campus minister at Loyola High School in Los Angeles, California. Rosie, welcome to the webinar. can you please tell us a little more about the Catholic Campus Ministry Association?
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining this webinar today. So essentially what we do at the Catholic Campus Ministry Association is we help with the professional development of college campus ministers all around the country so that they're better equipped to serve and to evangelize college students around the country.
Great. Dr. Josh Packard is the co-founder of Future of Faith and one of the foremost experts in the spiritual lives of American youth and religious trends in the US. He is an accomplished researcher in the sociology of religion and new forms of religious expression, and was previously the executive director of Springtide Research Institute. He has authored numerous books and articles in both popular and academic outlets, including Church Refugees, Sociologists Reveal Why People Are Done with Church But Not Their Faith, and Meaning Making, 8 Values That Drive America's Newest Generations. Josh, welcome. Please tell us more about what you're up to these days with Future of Faith.
Thanks so much. It's really great to be here. This is, I think, a really important conversation to be having at this moment as discipleship and so much for the young people are changing and constantly in flux. At Future of Faith, we're really trying to take the data seriously that the primary way to gain trust and credibility with somebody, especially with young people in this day and age, is through listening. I think this bucks some of our traditional notions of what ministry looks like, that it has to be programmatic and it has to be a sort of sage on the stage approach. But all the data are telling us that it needs to be more relational. It needs to be rooted in listening, which of course, is right in line with the Pope's push for synodality. And then help people try to answer that question of, okay, well, if listening is the answer, how do we do this? How do we do this at scale? How do we do this well? How do we do this in a way that has maximum impact? And so we're doing research and building some free resources that people can find at futurefaith.org. That's our entire mission, is just to try and help the church listen better.
Great. It's great to have you both here. Your co-hosts are Father John Gribowicz, who is a high school instructor of theology in San Francisco, as well as the director of curriculum for Sunday to Sunday Productions. You can hear his whole bio in episode 1 if you go back to that webinar if you want to hear about it. As well as mine, I'm the director of product and innovation. My name is Dave, and we'll be guiding you through today. So let's get straight into it. I'm going to spend some time going through the findings. A couple of these came from the initial. So let's just talk about this. The discipleship study that we did was on U.S. Catholics who attend Mass, and we conducted that study 3 years ago. And we collected the data in 2021. So this is post-COVID data. We released the general report in 2022, and we are now releasing 2 additional reports, one on segmentation, which I'll go into in a minute, and another on additional correlations between questions, which I'll also talk about. And so that's kind of the point of this whole series. That's why we're unpacking it. We want to show you these insights, but rather than just drop a bunch of data, we want to actually discuss it and unpack it. So what you're going to see is the actual data slides. There's sometimes a lot of information on them, more than you maybe would want in a presentation. So I will point my little laser pointer around and hopefully guide us through so we can all pay attention to the most important things. And without further ado, let's talk about it. So we're talking about generational differences today. The basic takeaway here was that we received almost three quarters of our responses, which was over 3,000 respondents, were female, and the age breakdown was a little slightly skewed bell curve, where as you can see, younger baby boomers were the most populous among respondents, followed by Gen X, and older baby boomers, followed by millennials, followed by post-war, and finally Gen Z, bringing up the rear. Let's see how this compares to the polls that we just took of our viewership today. So Nick, could you throw up the don't throw them away, throw up the results of the first poll, please? Thank you. All right, so we see the 45 to 60 range was the largest, and that is a little. So they're skewing a little bit younger than we did in the overall U.S. study that we conducted. That's more of the Gen X thing. Also, 3 years have gone by, from the data, so there's that too. Then we have followed by an even split between the 29 to 44 and the next one. But great, so we got to get a sense. It breaks down a little bit younger, but basically another bell curve looks like. And then let's see the age, the ages here too. Okay, 60-40 male female. All right, so that's what we're dealing with. A little bit different than that. Before we go on to the next slide, I want to ask one more question of the audience here. So, question is, how interested are you in furthering your formation as a disciple to help you in sharing your faith? So here's poll number 3, and the options are: you're not interested, you're slightly interested, you're moderately interested, or you're extremely interested. Again, in furthering your faith, your formation as a disciple to help you in sharing your faith. Okay, continuing on. So I mentioned that we wanted to do 2 more kind of investigations into the data. One of them was to understand where along kind of the path of spiritual maturity were people who responded to the study. And so the way we did that, Hans Plate over at Vinia Research, who we partnered with on the study, he actually had to get a high-level statistician to build an algorithm to parse the data and find where the segmentations were. So 2 of the questions that we asked were around strength, perceived strength in all these different areas of discipleship, and perceived need for growth in those same areas. We tried to break down the life of a disciple into all these different areas. And what we got was, so every one of these circles is a response, is one of the 3,137 responses that we got. And they're colored based on kind of these segmentations that we found of similarities between how they answered other questions throughout the study and these ones. And so the first thing you have is the segment 1 in the middle, this middling segment that said, I'm okay at these different areas of discipleship, and I have a medium need for growth. So just kind of, we called it the middling segment. Over here in segment 2, we have probably the most promising segment, but of course it's the smallest at 3%. What we're calling strong aspiring, people who feel strong in their level of the strength that they have in discipleship, and report that they have a high need for growth. Segment 3 over here are those that we're calling the strong complacent, where they said, well, I'm strong in my discipleship, so I don't really need to grow. Down here, segment 4, again, another promising segment, and the second smallest at 6%, were those who said that I'm not super strong in my discipleship, but I do have a lot to grow, and so we're calling that with the weak aspiring. Finally, the weak complacent, where I think you really don't want to be, where you say, you know what, I'm really not much of a disciple, and I'm fine with that. I'm going to stay there. And so I wanted to spend a little bit of time on this slide that we've looked at before, just to help us understand these next few slides, where we break down generations by these segments that we have kind of identified among the population. So looking at this next one, while boomers are the largest group in each segment, you can see the tallest pillar on this column graph. The 2 complacent segments skew older. So those who are either weak complacent, they don't feel like they need to grow in their faith, they're more likely to be older generations. And the weak aspiring, those who don't feel strong but recognize a large need for growth, is the youngest among the population. When it comes to so this one, don't be deceived. This is a reverse graph, if you want, where the bottom 2 scores of where it's not an area of strength, or I'm doing okay in this area, are the tallest pillars. So this is reporting how strong do you feel you are in these different levels of these different areas of discipleship. And what we can see is pretty much across the board, it's the younger generations seem to be not feeling like they're as strong. So there's definitely a correlation between age and perceived level of strength across the areas of discipleship. It's even more pronounced when we talk about how much growth people feel like they need for themselves. So again, now we're talking about the top 2 areas where they do need a moderate or great amount of growth. You can see all the way down, Gen Z is the highest, followed by millennials and so forth. It's almost a linear progression, where the younger someone is, the more likely it is that they say that they have a great deal of need for growth in the spiritual life. When it comes to prayer, we have an opposite linear graph where we see that the older someone is, the more likely it is that they pray 7 days a week. So the oldest generations are almost 79% of them report praying every day of the week. And then down to Gen Z, the only I've called this out before. Sorry, millennials, we are praying the least, even less than those from Gen Z who reported to our study. When it comes to interest in discipleship formation, I think this one's pretty obvious. So when I asked this question of you guys earlier, so Gen Z is far and away more likely to be extremely interested in furthering their formation as a disciple to help them in sharing their faith compared to other generations. Nick, can we pull up the answers to that third poll to see how we compare here? So good. Okay, this is nice to see. 50% are extremely interested, 40% are moderately interested, and no one is not interested. So that is very nice to see. Okay, good. We're talking to the right people. You guys clearly care about this stuff for yourself and hopefully for others as well. Okay, this one is a little complex, but we're talking about spiritual direction now. So we asked the question, have you ever, are you currently receiving or have ever received spiritual direction? So this is broken into those who are currently receiving and then by generation, those who used to receive and those who have never received spiritual direction. And when it comes to the answers of why they're not currently receiving, what was interesting was millennials, Gen Xers, and younger baby boomers are more likely to report that they don't know how to find someone, whereas the youngest and oldest generations said, "No, I'm in a good enough place. I don't need spiritual direction right now." They were much more likely to state that as their reason why they're not currently receiving it. As for why people have never received spiritual direction, across the board, the younger generations are more likely to report that they don't know how to find someone for spiritual direction. When it comes to interest in geographical connections, so we asked the question, how interested are you in connecting with others who share your faith beliefs in the following locations? And we went from local all the way to international. The big call out here is that Gen Z is the most interested, most likely to be very interested in connecting with others internationally than any other generation is, even more so than they are interested in connecting nationally with others, which was, I think, a little bit interesting. When it comes to using faith apps, this also was a little bit surprising for us. It wasn't the youngest generations that were most likely, and it wasn't the oldest generations. It was actually in the middle. So post-war is kind of past the area of regularly using faith apps, faith-based apps, spiritual, religious, what do you want to call it? And it was Gen Xers and Boomers that really are the most likely to be using faith apps regularly, and we define that as at least 3 days a week. This next one has a lot of information. We're talking about what are the aspects of Catholicism that they most closely identify with. And so here are these aspects on the left, and we kind of broke it down by, of course, these generations all across the top. The ones that stick out to me are that, you know, the older the person, the more likely that prayer is an aspect that they identify with. And that the youngest generations are much more likely to associate tradition as an area of Catholicism that they identify with than the older ones. So I'm going to stop there and open it up for discussion. I want to take this wherever we want it to go to start. So I guess for Josh and for Rosie, were there things that particularly jumped out at you as being surprising, unique to this study, unique to Catholics maybe? What did you think?
Yeah, so I love data. So this was really, really fun and interesting to kind of unpack and read through earlier this week. There's several things that came to my mind. The notion of spiritual direction when I was on the campus of USC, when I was working at CALL, the Catholic Association for Latino Leadership, and even at CCMA, that notion of access is a big deal. Like, and folks like not knowing how to access spiritual directors. So what we did in all three of those locations is we started a spiritual direction program where we were recruiting and finding spiritual directors so that we could then connect them with young people. Because access is just, they just don't know where to go. So if we can create those pathways, I think that's really beneficial. I was really intrigued with the faith apps was another component that you mentioned on there. I was actually quite surprised that 57 to 75% of folks are using it 3 times a week. Like I thought it was a win, like, and great for all people of all generations to be utilizing faith apps in their own spiritual life. The last thing that I'll mention, there's a lot more I could say, but the last thing I'll kind of mention before I have Josh speak is I'm kind of interested too, and I've mentioned this to Josh in the past, that like this survey had like 75% of women who filled it out and 25% male. Practitioners are telling me that they're seeing more men in the pews than they're seeing more women in the pews as of late. And it's kind of a new post-COVID reality that they're seeing. I don't know if there's a study already on this, but it would be interesting. If they're in the pews, are they active disciples? I don't know the answer to that either. But I wonder if we did this study in 5 or 10 years, if that would more even out, if it'd be more 50-50 men and women.
Yeah, that's interesting. And, I will also just call out, since it's relevant, I think, to what you're saying, how we went about finding these people, because, the usual way that you would run a national survey like this is to rent a list of people who say they're Catholic and carry on with it. When we did that, we got no people who passed the screener question that I attend mass every week. And so, what we did instead was we reached out to Catholic organizations that we felt would have, their lists would be full of mass attending Catholics. And we said, hey, do this for us, send this survey to your list, and in return, we'll give you the data as well. And so that's how we reach people. So it's possible that maybe just those people's lists are more full of women than the average, church would be. That could be related to.
Well, the gender dynamics in American religion are worthy of their own podcast. But I mean, suffice it to say, I think it's important to at least note here that there's a lot going on in our society with regards to gender and power that are unfolding at levels beyond just the church, but that certainly the church feels, primarily with regards to women just having more access to more positions of power than they've ever had before in our history, and men simultaneously retreating from many of those spaces and looking for other places to be able to live out their agency. And church becomes then a piece of the answer about what's going on there as they look for places to express their own, inner lives and their own agency. Well, I think for years I've been saying that there's this, in terms of this data specifically, I've been saying that as this is not a researcher position, it's just like what I keep hearing is like, I've had the opportunity to speak and interact with a whole lot of people who are doing ministry, and I've had the opportunity to collect some data and hear from lots of young people out in the world who are supposed to be receiving that ministry. And it seems like there's this like disconnect between like all these adults who would genuinely will do almost anything for young people, and all these young people who are saying like, oh, I could really use more discipleship, or I could really use more spiritual direction, or whatever it is. And like they just can't figure out, how to connect with each other, like how to cross that divide. And in some cases, it's because we're offering very old models to very new problems that just aren't resonating with young people. But I think part of it shows up here in the data, which is that sometimes young people just don't even know. I wouldn't even know what to Google for, or what to ask ChatGPT for, or my parents for. That I don't know the words to use to ask for how to get spiritual direction. So I think a lot of this is a communication. I'm curious, Rosie, when you implemented those programs before, were you making brand new programs, or were you trying to help simply like voice and give some structure to what was already existing to connect with young people? Because I think sometimes that could be part of the answer too.
Yeah, it's a very both and question, very Catholic, right? Because some of our young people were already in spiritual direction, they just didn't have the language to surround it. And it's interesting too, because we had to call it spiritual mentorship versus spiritual direction, which made it more accessible to the young people as well. And at CCMA, we call it spiritual direction because they're college campus ministers, and all of them tend to know what it is. But in these other 2 locations, spiritual mentorship was a change of language.
Do you think that's because like the idea that somebody is going to direct me toward some predetermined end is just not anything that is not something that young people are like, maybe Father John, maybe you have like insight into this too, that like, that is just not something I'm interested in signing up for. Mentorship, on the other hand, like somebody who's going to accompany me and walk beside me, I'm here for that. I just am not interested in sort of being dragged to a predetermined point.
Yeah, I think we somehow unfortunately got stuck with the term spiritual direction, when really even a good spiritual director is not supposed to be a director. So it's just interesting how we are stuck with this terminology, and it's really not what spiritual direction is about. I mean, I remember my first spiritual director, and that's like going like 25 years ago. And he would often say, "Is like, consider me more of a guide than a director," and I think that was helpful. Um, some use the word counselor, spiritual counselor, but it's really about having someone who's listening and is helping you connect the dots more than, kind of trying to get you to a certain predetermined place in the spiritual director's mind. So, that's one thing. But, I'm very curious about the whole concept of mentorship as well. I mean, yeah, that's a very accessible term, and I love that term, and I've completely valued the mentors in my own life, and I still do, and I still am always actively looking for mentors. But the one thing that I often hear, and maybe this is a good time for us to talk about, is just that there seems to be this kind of um, I don't know what the right word is, but somehow misfire between, say, a boomer generation and a millennial Gen Z generation, in that millennials and Gen Z just don't seem to desire the mentorship of boomers. And it seems as if boomers haven't made enough of an effort to try to mentor younger generations. I mean, there's criticism on both sides. And I'm curious as to what, in your experience from your work and your studies that you've been able to do you see some of that coming through? I can only say on a personal level, I do feel that people who are younger, I'm going to say anyone under the age of 40, they seem to be a little suspicious, if especially in church space, in Catholic church space. They're suspicious of a boomer generation because they just don't feel as if somehow they're, let's say, Catholic enough, or they don't get it as to how they want to live the faith. And so they just, avoid that. But then at that point, it's like they're not really getting guidance from anyone, it seems like, other than amongst themselves on like a parallel level. But that's not really guidance. That's, if, at best, that's maybe some form of accompaniment, but it's not really, really being able to learn from like the wisdom. So I don't know. Could you speak of anything about that?
So I can try. I think for me, I'm going to lean on the notion of relationality and relationship that we have with the people that we serve. So when I think about working at USC specifically, the students there trusted myself and the campus ministers and the pastor, and really desired to grow not only in their faith, but they knew they were at USC for a reason. They were there so that they could also grow professionally. So because they built trust with us, when we started a professional mentorship program, we had donors and alumni who also trusted us and trusted what we were doing. And we were able to make that link between the two in a way that was authentic. But I think it's because there was trust built and there was relationship built between all parties. So, and I'm talking about folks who are highly active in their faith too. Like, this is not just a regular student on the USC campus necessarily. Like, maybe there was a few that were just like random students who were coming through our doors. But for those who were more highly engaged and there was relationship and trust built, we were easily able to make those links happen. Yeah, that's probably the best answer I could give. So I don't know if you have any insight, Josh.
That's very encouraging. I really appreciate hearing that.
I think Rosie is dead on with this idea of trust. Well, first I'll say, Father John, they're not just relying on each other. They also have influencers on TikTok and Instagram that they can turn to. If that makes you feel any better.
I know that. Yes. Yeah.
The issue of trust, I think, is exactly right. That we know that institutional trust has been declining in this country for a very long time, for 50 years. It's been steady. Every year it goes down and down and down. Every year, it seems, every summer, with regularity, Gallup will put out an update that says, no, this year, clergy and teachers and police officers are at an all-time low. And then next year, it's like, no, this year they're at an, it's like, that doesn't seem to be like there's ever going to be a bottoming out. But that doesn't mean that trust has declined, right? So what has happened over the last half a century or so, starting in the 1970s, is that trust has been relocated. It used to be situated in an institution or inside of your authority given to you by an institution, like you have a PhD or you are a priest or whatever. And now it has moved away from the institution and toward the individual. And there are a lot of reasons for this. We don't have to unpack all of them right now. But what Rosie's talking about here is like, we had trust. It's because we had relationships. That is not uncommon at all. But I think that is very generational. And I've told this story before. And I tell a lot, actually, because I think it's so indicative of just how to illustrate this shift. when I was talking to my dad about this Catholic, grew up Catholic, Catholic neighborhood, Catholic school, all of it. And I said, who was influential to you as a kid? Who could have gotten you to change your behavior or do something? And he said, well, I guess, the priest. And I said, well, I don't remember you talking about a priest. Who was it? And he said, oh, not anybody in particular, just whoever was the priest at the time. Right. And when I told that story to my students, flash forward, from the 1950s when he was growing up until, to 2019, when I told the story to my students, they audibly laughed out loud at the idea that he would listen to somebody just because they were a priest. And of course, that was not lost on me because I was a professor standing up in front of them and I would like for them to listen to me just because I was their professor. Um, but they were like, they would tell me, like, I would listen to a priest who knew me, but not just to a priest. And I think that illustrates this exact thing that Rosie's talking about, of the shift of like, oh yeah, we were able to do things, we were able to do mentorship, and we were able to cross those generational divides because we had trust with people, because we had relationships with them. Whereas I think a lot of older generations approach this, what my dad said when I first started sharing some of this data with him, maybe 5-6 years ago, he's like, why would anybody listen to somebody who doesn't know anything? That's just one person's opinion, right? But now it's like, if that one person doesn't know me, why would I listen to anything they have to say?
That's
I
such an
think it's a
interesting point.
whole shift, right?
That's such an interesting point, Josh, because what do we make of the influencers then that you mentioned about, like, on like TikTok and whatnot? I mean, how many people are following, like, Robert Barron just because he's a bishop? I mean, hardly anyone knows him personally, right? But like, there's great trust placed on every word that he says, right? So like,
Yeah.
there is that with the whole sense of, say, the social media influencers. I mean, what do we make of that?
Well, and it's a huge. Rosie, I'm really curious to hear if you see this coming up on campuses. But the study group 3 for the Synod on Synodality is all about digital missionaries. And so, what do we do with these influencers? I mean, the Vatican doesn't like to use the term influencer, but that's what they are. How do we build trust in a credible way here? But the other part of this, and so I think people are grappling with that exact question. And at the same time, this move towards, like, we're going to be emerging into an AI world is just going to push trust even down even further to the local. It doesn't mean people won't engage with stuff that's online. They certainly will. It's just that they're not going to trust anything that they can't see and touch and feel. I mean, we're all going to be doubting Thomases because nobody will know what is sort of real and what is AI, even when they're encountering it online. And so that's my fairly strong hypothesis that it's just going to become even more relational in the future.
John, you're doing a lot of work with Sunday to Sunday, trying to open up the word preaching and to help us understand that everyone has these preaching moments in their lives, whether or not they're clergy or sitting at a pulpit or whatever. And I think that that's so important to be able to get vulnerable and personal with people, so that they can come to know you and not just the station you represent or something in the world. And I wonder if that's the way in for the church, because the fact that the data was showing that the youngest generations are more closely identifying with tradition, and these are among, of course, mass attending Catholics, which is a tiny percentage of all people who say that they're Catholic, which is a tiny percentage of all people, at this point. And so, I think that you guys were kind of hinting around that traditionalist versus progressive. Father John, earlier you were saying like how, maybe one of the reasons that there isn't so much good mentorship happening between boomers and the younger generations is because of that kind of like difference in expression of the faith that they maybe are perceiving, which is true. So now the more that we don't get personal and don't approach trust in that way, the more the church is going to continue to be a club for those who just view institutions as worthy of respect without necessarily earning it in the kind of the way that their peers have come to expect, which is going to create even more divisiveness between them.
Because are you suggesting that the idea that someone appreciates the tradition of the church, I mean, that's in a certain sense, is a very a high institutional value right there, right? I mean,
Right.
so if older generations have been like, burned by the institution. They're clearly not going to be mentoring or be inspirational for younger people who are yearning for tradition,
Right.
unless they're an older person who is very traditional. I mean,
Right.
that would be the point of contact. I mean, it's such an interesting type of time we're in, because there's all this kind of idea, like we don't trust people, we don't trust institutions. Let's start there, and we don't trust people who represent those institutions. But then there's this whole other thing where it's like, no, we want the church to be more like forceful, more prominent, more countercultural, and whatever that means, to be like this kind of bastion of truth and goodness and whatnot. And that seems to be a very highly institutional type of way of thinking, that the church has clout over society. So I don't know what to make of that. I mean, is that just some type of reaction to like people who have just become let's just say, they've become so ungrounded because of their distrust of institution, that the reaction to it's like, no, we have to actually look at the institution for the good that it is, and that's why there's a move towards traditionalism. I don't know. I'm just kind of thinking that out loud.
I guess another question I would have, is just that is this traditionalism that we're seeing among younger Catholics true of other denominations as well, or is that something that is unique to the Catholic tradition? Are you guys able to speak to that, Josh or Rosie?
I mean, there is a shift. I wouldn't get too carried away with this. I mean, I think part of the reason why this shift makes news is because it's novel, because it's news. But when describing the rank and file, it is still largely in the middle of the story of, it's not even disaffiliation anymore. We're clearly in a stage of unaffiliation. It's like a priest asked me one time, like, why are all these young people leaving the church? I'm like, well, they're not. They weren't here to begin with. It's their parents who left the church 15, 20, 25 years ago. And that has leveled off, but now we're in this era where kids are being raised without any faith at all. There's been an uptick recently, and maybe it'll play out into a trend, but I wouldn't like look at this as like it's too early to start thinking like, oh, we weathered the storm. Like this is somehow the life raft here, and we're going to be just fine because people are coming back to traditional ways. We can hope for that if you want to, but I don't know that the data tell us like that's where we should stake a claim.
I would just personally agree with that, Josh. I think that the traditionalist movement, so to speak, is a very loud and well-organized movement, but it is still an extremely small movement. And there's really no guarantee that any of that is going to like withstand the storm, so to speak, as you said, because like it's too early to tell like really what's going on there. But it is small, it is very loud, it's very vocal, and I think that even bishops are kind of struggling to figure out what to do with it. Like they're like, well, if the young people are coming to this, even though it's a small group of people, but they seem to be pretty well organized and pretty committed and, and showing up, and this is what they want. And especially if you're a bishop who tends to like traditional things, I mean, you're getting all excited, like, all right, well, we got to put our energy there. But it just simply is, I have absolutely zero experience of that in any work that I do of people day to day who are moving in that direction. I just don't have any experience of it. I mean, I'm not saying other priests don't. I personally don't have experience of it because I work in a large Catholic high school in San Francisco where I can't pick out any students who would gravitate towards something of traditional. No one. So, but that's just my experience.
So I was meeting with somebody up in the Bay Area, and she was really concerned. So she's a parishioner at a Newman Center up there, because she was just concerned because there was a group of students who were highly traditional, and she was just nervous. And my answer to her was, when I was at UC San Diego at the age of 18, like I gravitated towards traditional ways of prayer, even though I was a cradle Catholic, but it was familiar and it was something that I knew that could help me feel like I was close to home. And I said, what helped me was mentors or people like you teaching me other things about the Catholic faith that helped me grow in my faith. I go, because I wasn't exposed to it. So if I wasn't exposed to it, how could I know anything different? And young people are impressionable. They're growing, they're learning, they're smart, and they're looking to learn about their faith in a deeper way. So I just feel like as newer Catholics, when they're young people, they're growing into themselves. And sometimes they gravitate towards traditional things in the beginning, but they're 18 to 22. Like, we evolve, we change. And yeah, that's why I think I struggle with even the terms traditional and progressive, specifically around faith, because I feel like we evolve and change over time, and we grow in our faith, and none of us fit in a box. So anyhow, that I hope that's helpful to kind of ruminate over too.
Yeah, but I'm going to just push back on that a little bit, because I'm 45 now, and when I became really into my faith, let's say high school and college, I clearly was very traditional. I would say conservative too, just because I was rediscovering, or maybe discovering for the first time, all the richness of the faith. And but I also did not realize, like, I came from a background when I was in grade school and in high school that actually exposed me to lots of different facets of the faith. But then I did not realize there was all these ideological positions that you had to take. And then I kind of took the conservative traditional one, because I just thought that was the one that you were supposed to take at the time. And, and now 20 some years later, I'm clearly not in that place at all. Like, I can't even identify myself with that version of Catholicism, so to speak. But a lot of my peers, they did not move on. They stayed there. They stayed there. And the ones and some who did move on actually moved out. They just kind of gave up on everything altogether. There is a small group, and I put myself in that group, who said, we had to kind of go beyond what we thought was so important with, like, say, tradition, and just kind of understanding doctrine inside and out, and kind of always falling onto that. Like, that's a small group. So, like, I don't know what happens with conservative / traditional. I know I don't like these terms either, but like, it's just a way to talk about things. I mean, because I would put myself there 20 some years ago. I'm not there now. I'm not anti-conservative or traditional, clearly, but I don't identify with that. But lots of people who are 45 now, who are married with kids, they're trying their best to still keep that going, and bringing that to their own families now. So that's my personal experience with that.
We're starting to get some questions in the Q&A, and I wanted to invite everyone who's listening to put your questions in, whether it's about this or anything we've talked about, anything about generations really at all, when it comes to discipleship. Whatever's on your mind, please ask away. The first two are from Jeremy, who asks, Father, have your students ever been introduced to traditional approach? And then he asks, why don't we use the term faithful instead of traditional / conservative / progressive, et cetera? I mean, as far as the second one, we're trying to make a distinction between different kind of approaches or expressions of the faith. I would hope that all of these people are composed the faithful, and I totally agree that the terms can be problematic and even divisive. Maybe I'll ask Rosie, do you have a preferred way to break that stuff down rather than those terms?
It's been a challenge for me, to be honest. And I usually just say, when I'm speaking, if I need to speak with folks about it, I'm like, I don't like using these terms, but this is the only language that I have that can kind of describe these positions or what I'm stating. Yeah, I just struggle with it because I don't feel like I fit in any of the categories. And I think that as a Christian, I want to be a bridge builder. Like, I just want to make sure that people know that they're seen and loved by God. And if I paste myself into a camp, there's going to be half of the church who's going to disregard me or ignore me, or what's the word that young people use? They just like cancel you. Right. And Christ is much larger than this. So anyhow, so I just struggle. I call myself Catholic, I guess.
Yeah, I agree. Amen.
John, for that other question, have your students ever been introduced to traditional approach? Is the question from Jeremy?
Yeah, I don't really quite understand the question in some ways, but when you're working with students who have no foundation whatsoever, I don't know what the traditional approach you're trying to introduce them to. I mean, like, as Rosie is saying, I mean, like, what I feel I'm called to do is to try to help a student recognize that their life has some sort of meaning and purpose, like foundationally, like that's where we're starting at. We're not even getting to like what devotions they should be doing, or like what prayers or how often they should be going to, like that is so far down the line. We're working with students who are questioning the love of God, and you're just caught up in the rat race of trying to just get through school with good grades to go to a good college to make a lot of money to live some type of comfortable life. That's the narrative that my students are working with. So I mean,
you said that only like 10% of them, even though you're at a Catholic high school, only 10% are like active Catholics. Was that right?
Yeah, and I would say that's generous. Yeah, there are some maybe cultural groups that tend to have more of a quote unquote traditional Catholicism. Filipino, Hispanic groups. There's a little bit of that there, but overall, I think the thing that I notice with this generation is that they just don't fully know what the meaning of life is. I know it sounds so big and existential, but it is really where we are. I mean, so to be offering versions of the faith in some way is like, I just don't have any real, I don't have time to do that, because that's not where they are. I mean, and I know that some people are like, well, if you just kind of bring them adoration and just show them the beauty of the Mass, then it all just kind of clicks. I mean, I have not had any proof of that. Unfortunately, I don't think that it works that way. And quite frankly, I don't think it should work that way. I do not think just that people should be caught up in just how amazing the Mass is, or how amazing these types of spiritual experiences that we somehow provide, because it falls into a form of spirituality that I call event spirituality, where we're just getting people to show up at events, and somehow that means that there's an inner transformation taking place, and that's just not simply the case. So I don't see it that way. I think it's supposed to be portals into that, but it's not endpoints at all where that happens.
This is such a good point that sometimes on webinars like these and in other places, because we live in the day-to-day of this so much, that I think it's easy to get carried away with the sort of more interesting but still fringe cases. We can forget that the rank and file young person, which I understand this is not a criticism of the study by DeSales at all. I mean, the point of the study from his is to understand the most active and faithful Catholics. But if you're in the sort of trenches, so to speak, every day, to remember that your average young person is spending approximately 0.05% of their time thinking about their faith. They're just not considering it that much. It's not like they're sifting between this spectrum of, political / theological positions, and then slotting themselves into the people that they most align with. Those are the ones we hear about, but they're worried about who they're sitting next to at lunch. They're worried about algebra, all the same things that kids have always worried about. Lincoln Snyder was my boss when I was at NCEA. He was the CEO at the time, and he had this great saying. He used to say, you cannot catechize somebody who hasn't been evangelized. And increasingly, the young people that we're seeing, even coming into our schools, they have not even been evangelized. They're still trying to figure out, what's the meaning of life? Who is God? What role does that play in my life? And we jump sometimes right into catechism, well, you're here, you're starting high school, day one of your religion class, here we go. And it rests on this set of assumptions that maybe were true 30, 40, 50 years ago, but are just increasingly not true anymore for these young people who are right, starting at square zero and not even square one.
We're doing behave, believe, belong. Right?
Yeah. And actually, too, another point too, you mentioned about let's say the political type of thing. I mean, I did an activity with students after the election, thinking that this would be really relevant and that they'd be somehow energized by it. And they were completely uninterested in it. They just had no time for the whole political stuff, because it's just not where they are. And you think, oh, they'd be just so whatever, anti-Trump or whatever, or something like that. That was not the case. They could care less about it. and I was and it was one of the most worst lessons I ever had, because I'm they had no energy behind it. And so even in that space, it was just that was not the case.
We have a question from Rebecca who asks, are there any specific ways that you have been able to reach young people who are interested in engaging with your organizations to be mentored in the faith? How do you do outreach so that they know that you're there, and what works best to engage them once they come? Rosie, what do you think?
Yeah, it's a long question. I had to open it up to look.
So yeah, so how are we reaching young people who might be engaging in mentorship? How do you do outreach, and then how do you engage once they actually do say yes?
Yeah, it's I'm going to lean back onto relationship. It's all about relationship. I mean, of course, you could do your normal like Sunday bulletin, things on social media and regular marketing components, but really like reaching out to the students who are maybe in Bible studies already or in small groups, because those students are the ones who are going to be more inclined to being in one-on-one spiritual direction. Perhaps it's a group of students, like we had a group of students on a weekly basis who were serving food to people who were homeless in downtown Los Angeles. So perhaps it's reaching out to that small group of folks to see if one of them wants to be in spiritual mentorship or professional mentorship. All of my student leaders at USC had to be paired up with a professional mentor. It was just part of the requirement for them to be in leadership so that they could continue to grow that acumen of leadership skills with somebody who was more just advanced in their career than them. So yeah, it really is about relationship, seeing where your small groups of students are like congregating already, and then inviting them into something a little bit deeper, which for us was professional or spiritual mentorship specifically. How do you outreach so they know that you're there? Yeah, so for me, so when I'm thinking about outreaching to other students outside the core amount of students that were on our college campus, it was really empowering those students with leadership skills so that they can then go out and reach their peers. Like I couldn't be inside the sororities and fraternities. I was not on the baseball field playing baseball with those students. Like it was my students who were in those roles that I had to teach how to evangelize to reach those other students. And again, it's just relationship and trust. As long as you can build that, not only through in yourself, but in the student leadership teams that you have across whatever ministry you're a part of, that's where things start to flourish, at least from my experience.
It sounds like there's kind of two components of it, right? There's having a program or some kind of spiritual mentors to direct people to once they raise their hands, and then there's the getting them to raise their hands thing, right? And you had kind of both figured out, because that's the problem, right? Like unless you're a spiritual mentor yourself who are offering your own thing, it's one thing to get the yes or to find the people and even be able to engage them, but then to say, oh, okay, well now I got to find someone to actually like pass them off to. So kind of getting that in place is key too.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and with the spiritual direction component, I went to the diocese and saw who they had on their spiritual direction list. And then I went to different schools of theology that have like spiritual direction certificates and had them give me a list. And that helped me grow a network, at least here in the LA area, that I can connect students to. Specifically for spiritual direction. I just want to make sure that the students were being taken care of. And then I had someone on our team, on our staff, who would talk to all the potential spiritual directors also, because we wanted to make sure that it was a good fit with a young person. Because some people don't know how to potentially do spiritual direction with a young person, like maybe they've never done it before. So yeah, there was a lot involved, but I mean, it's worth it. The quote I love to use is, discipleship and evangelization is not, it is effective, but it's not efficient. And I think that's the way mentorship is. I think that's the way, so we got to live our faith. Yeah, sure. It's not going to be efficient all the time, but it will be effective if we just put the time and energy into it.
Rosie, that reminds me of this quote. I met who became a fast friend. He's a youth minister at Potter's House in Dallas, Protestant congregation. But he said, the equation or the variables are time, trust, and truth. And we used to think that if we just told them the truth, they would want to spend more time with us. And then we would gain trust, we gain their trust, and then they would spend more time with us. But in reality, it works the other way around. The more time we spend with them, the more we get their trust, and then we can talk to them about truth. And that was just from his experience doing youth ministry. And then we just got back the data from a national study that we're doing about the relationship between faith formation and listening, and they're overwhelming. I just pulled them up here. It's like 70% say that if for somebody who takes the time to listen to me, I'm more willing to listen to them about future things, important topics in the future. That's incredible. Like the way you gain that trust is by practicing the listening, but that's hard. So to Rebecca's question, like, how do you do that? I think we are in this era of trying to figure out how to do that. We've got I'm not trying to sell you anything. There are free tools on Future Faith where we're trying to help people figure this out, how to do this at scale, because how many relationships can you reasonably, try and carry? If you've got dozens or hundreds of people, we have to start, putting our heads together. We have to get as sophisticated about listening and relational approaches as we've been about programs for the last, I don't know, few decades. But I think we can get there. But it's clear that, like you said, relationships and listening are going to have to be at the center of it.
Do you guys can you think of any individuals who you have seen kind of go through, whether it's spiritual mentorship or, the people being impacted through youth programs that you've had a hand in, where you've been able to see it really work and come alive and give you encouragement in the work?
Yeah, thousands. Maybe thousands, but a lot.
Tell us one or two.
um, yeah, so I mean, there was a young woman, a really intelligent young woman who was a student of mine at USC. I was meeting with her at least twice a month for spiritual mentorship. And I think she really struggled with institutional trust, with just the church in general. And I helped just accompany her and listen to her and in her journey. She also struggled with a lot of mental health issues. And I'm grateful to have been in the time and place that she needed me the most. And not just me. I mean, it was really the staff at the Catholic Center helped her through that mental health issue that she was going through. Now she is still active in her faith, living in Chicago, doing her thing, and continuing to grow as an individual and as a professional. I mean, we have not super regular contact, probably like quarterly or every semester contact or so. But I know her mom pretty well. So I'm very grateful just to hear that things are going really well for her. Um, there was a student, this was a while back, at the University of New Mexico. When I was in New Mexico, it was 2006 to 2010, and I was young. I graduated JST in 2006, so it was barely starting in ministry, and I hadn't really been exposed to a lot of people with mental health issues. But in New Mexico, it's one of the poorest states in the country with not a lot of access to mental health facilities. So it was my first time in like ministry, really kind of experiencing people. There was a high suicide rate in the state of New Mexico, just a lot of things going on in that state. The accompaniment of this one young man, and it was a group effort again, because I know I was young and I know my limits. But accompanying him, he came out of his shell in a way that I hadn't seen previously, and really to this day. He used to come into the Catholic Center with like a hoodie on, like over his head, and like kind of downtrodden. But because of the ministry, the accompaniment, the trust, the love that we had for him, I mean, he was dating somebody by the time I left, and was really growing in his faith and continuing to grow in his faith. And those are just two stories that come to my mind of accompaniment that really helped. Like, I think the one-on-one and as well as the community component really just helped transform these two young people's lives.
Beautiful. Well, we are coming up on time here, so I just wanted to start to close us out. Normally, this is the time in the webinar where I would start to talk about the upcoming webinars in the series, but there aren't any. This is it. We've finished 6 for 6. What is coming up is the podcast. And so Father John and I are very active right now in doing interviews to create season 1 of Religion to Reality, the podcast. You'll be able to find out more about it at the same place you've always go to, where you'll also be able to find the recording for today's webinar, as well as the deck of slides at religiontoreality.org. The URL is right there on the screen. The podcast is going to be a chance for us to still kind of riff on all of this data that we found in the study, but launch into stories like the ones that you just heard from Rosie, to hear more about like, how is this lived, right? Like, so it's great to get, kind of the statistically significant data, but it's even better to kind of recognize that each one of these people is really a whole life that we're talking about, and we want to let's get into it. What does this really mean where the rubber hits the road? So yeah, that's all that stuff. Like I said before, there's a whole bunch of other slides in the appendix that we didn't get to today, but there's a lot more that we learned about generational differences. So please do go to religiontoreality.org to access the recording and the slide deck, and eventually the podcast. By the way, when you sign up for our stuff, you'll be able to sign up to hear from us in the future. So that's how you'll know when the podcast does in fact drop, sometime I think in the spring. And that's basically it from religion to reality. We've been happy to journey with you. Oh, and one last thing, there's a quick feedback survey at the end of this after we finish that you'll be invited to fill out. We always find that helpful. So thank you for joining us, and happy Monday. Have a great one, guys. Bye.